Good evening, everyone. My name is Father Kevin Sandberg. I am a Holy Cross priest, and as a faculty member at the Center for Social Concerns, I am its acting executive director this year. More importantly, for tonight's topic, I'm the son of a union carpenter. And it is my distinct pleasure then to welcome you to the 2017 McBride Lecture. This biennial event is designed to expose the Notre Dame community and local communities as well to nationally recognized labor leaders. It is a lecture series established in 1977 by the United Steelworkers. By name and purpose, which is to better understand the principles of unionism and our economy, it honors the USW's fourth international president, Lloyd McBride, who served from 1977 to 1983. Tonight's lecture is co-sponsored by the USW and the Higgins Labor Program. The Higgins Labor Program is an interdisciplinary unit of the Center for Social Concerns. It sponsors research, education, and community engagement on issues involving work and labor. And given that it is part of the Center for Social Concerns, whose vision it is to become a living well of social justice, the Higgins Labor Program is especially informed by and formative of the Catholic social tradition's commitment to the dignity of work and the rights of workers. That commitment got a great shot in the arm in 1981 with John Paul II's encyclical Laborem Exercens, which asserted the priority of labor over capital and forwarded a vision of human labor in which each worker in his or her own working, worked for his or herself, not as a cog in a wheel, but as the true subject of his or her endeavor. My own father and mother's labor gave me time to reflect, time to wonder, time to imagine. In other words, an education, which is what we will get tonight. In that realm of education, shepherding the Higgins Labor Program is a man who, for the dedication, creativity, and expertise he lends to social justice, might otherwise be Bruce Springsteen, but for a guitar, a band, and roots in New Jersey. Perhaps even but for vocal cords and any other semblance, or lack thereof, I don't know. I leave that to you. Whether it is for his critical reflection on art, or his one-off film classes on classic films and his Labor Song of the Month selections, or for the stimulating lunchtime labor raps presentations and afternoon labor cafe conversations that he organizes. And RAPS stands for Research, Advocacy, and Policy Series, or for his blog on the labor question and the audacious Just Wage Working Group that he, along with Professor Clemens Sedmak, has brought together. Won't you please join me in welcoming to the stage to introduce tonight's speaker, this award-winning professor and advisor who holds a joint appointment between the Department of History and the Center for Social Concerns, the director of the Higgins Labor Program, Dan Graff.
It's probably the first and last time I'll be compared to Bruce Springsteen. But I appreciated that. I will note, in thanking Father Kevin for that really generous introduction, that there's a new Labor Song of the Month that's going to go live tomorrow. So those of you who are old enough to remember Stevie Wonder's Livin' for the City, that's the next entry, and it links explicitly to tonight's talk on the need to be combining and realizing the connections always between economic and racial justice. So, you know, if your appetite for my take on music was whetted by Kevin's introduction, please look for the Labor Song of the Month at the Higgins Labor Program's website tomorrow. Again, Stevie Wonder. Okay, so good evening. Welcome to the 36th McBride Lecture at the University of Notre Dame. I have a few folks to thank before introducing tonight's honored guest. So thanks first to Father Kevin, Acting Director of the Center for Social Concerns, for his leadership and his energy. And the same to Associate Director Bill Purcell, for his ongoing and active encouragement of our efforts at the Higgins Labor Program, but really thanks as well to the staff of the Center for Social Concerns as a whole, who have become such a welcoming home of supporters and collaborators for the Higgins Labor Program for close to a decade now. It's really been my pleasure and honor to get to work with all the folks at the CSC, and I'm really interested in keeping that going. In particular, just a few names, I want to thank the communications team at the center, JP Shortall, Katie McCauley, and Cindy Vole, for their great work in designing, distributing, and promoting our publicity for events like this one. My greatest gratitude, though, goes to Administrative Assistant Judy Benchar, who's probably out there busy getting ready for the post-lecture reception, as well as Student Assistant Julie Mardini, who has class tonight, but both of whom help keep the small but feisty Higgins Labor Program running. Well, the Higgins Labor Program has been partnering with the United Steelworkers for many years, and we're grateful for their ongoing support for this initiative, the McBride Lecture series. The USW, led by President Leo Gerard, is one of the most dynamic US and Canadian-based labor unions operating today, and what I think is frankly a hostile climate for organized labor. Leo's a sharp thinker and eloquent speaker whose contributions to the Huffington Post, for those who read him, consistently skewer the inflated rhetoric of the punditry, offering common sense ideas on issues of trade, manufacturing, jobs, and economic fairness. So if you're not a regular reader, I encourage you to look up Leo Gerard, who has a regular column in the Huffington Post online. Well, tonight's honored speaker, another USW leader, also comes tonight to deliver some common sense thinking. And the timing is ripe. Indiana became ground zero in the debate over jobs and justice during the 2016 presidential campaign, as two USW-represented companies, Carrier and Rexnord, drew the attention of presidential candidates promising to bring manufacturing back to the heartland and to keep jobs from migrating elsewhere. That debate continues in 2017. Are these jobs staying? Are they leaving? Are they growing? I think it depends on who you listen to, but you should look for real facts, not alternative ones. Well, I'd like to listen to what the union representing those workers and many, many others throughout North America has to say on this topic. And that's why we invited Mr. Fred Redmond, the USW's Executive Vice President for Human Relations, to speak tonight. But there's another reason we asked Mr. Redmond in particular. We occupy a moment in this country's history where economic duress, extreme partisanship, and heated racial conflict have rubbed our political culture raw. Fred Redmond has spent a career promoting economic justice and racial justice, and seeing the connections between the two. He joined the Steelworkers Union when he went to work at Reynolds Metals in McCook, Illinois, back in 1973, the same year that Livin' for the City was released. You probably listened to it quite a lot. He worked his way up through the ranks as a shop steward, a grievance committee member and chairman, and eventually 3 terms as local president, before joining the USW staff in a variety of positions. In addition to serving as executive vice president, as he does today, he also serves as chairman of the union's Civil and Human Rights Department and as joint chairman of the USW's Next Generation program for developing young leaders. He's also a member of the broader labor movement, the AFL-CIO's Executive Council. He's Midwest Regional Representative of the Coalition of Black Trade Unionists and chair of the board of directors of the A. Philip Randolph Institute, which honors the legendary and pioneering black trade unionist. Last, Fred is currently co-chair of the AFL-CIO's Labor Commission on Racial and Economic Justice, created in 2015 to facilitate a broad conversation with local labor leaders around racial and economic disparities and institutional biases, and to identify ways for unions to become more inclusive as new entrants to the labor force diversify. In other words, Fred Redmond's a very busy man, tackling big important issues, and we're very grateful that he took the time to come to Notre Dame tonight and speak to us. The scope of the problems that he could address are huge, but we've only given him 30 to 35 minutes to talk to you. So still, we'll see what he can solve. He's got his work cut out for him, but I think he's up to the task, and I really look forward to hearing what he has to say, as well as to your questions and comments afterward. So please give a Notre Dame welcome to Mr. Fred Redmond.
Thank you. Well, good evening, everybody. After that overly generous introduction and that warm reception, I don't know about y'all, but I can't wait to hear what I'm going to say. Well, look, I am honored to be here at this great university with you at this Lord McBride Lecture series. I want to thank Father Sandberg and thank my friend Dan Graff for having me here. I really, really appreciate the fact that I have this opportunity to address this lecture series that was named after our fourth international president, Lloyd McBride. Lloyd was a pioneer. He opened up many doors in our union for women, for people of color. And Lloyd will always be remembered as a hero in our labor movement, and for Notre Dame to continue to promote his legacy through this labor series, we are most grateful as the Steelworkers Union to be partners with you in doing such. I want to recognize my Steelworkers family that's here. I want to thank you all for coming out. And, you know, as I thought about this talk on struggle for racial and economic justice, I started to wonder about all of you. I started to wonder about the University of Notre Dame and how a Catholic university shapes its students, its faculty, its staff, and the community. So I went to your website, and the first thing I saw was the most prominent item, I think, on your webpage was a quote from your university president, the Reverend John Jenkins. And this was 2 weeks after the events in Charlotte, Virginia. And Jenkins said these words: racism, anti-Semitism, and hatreds of any kind are malignancies of the heart. Now, those hatreds that Reverend Jenkins was talking about, I would interpret them to mean anti-Muslim, anti-feminist, anti-immigrant, anti-physically or mentally challenged, anti-poor, and those things. And that statement implies from your president, in my opinion, what he's saying is those things are sinful. That's how I interpret his statement. And that says a lot about you and the University of Notre Dame. That statement, headlining your website, announces your values as being inclusiveness. Your values include unity, and your values include love. And that statement suggests to me that the community of Notre Dame believes, as I do, that we all rise together, or we all lose separately. And look, this is important because as Charlottesville showed us, we live in a time when leaders in this country have indicated directly to racists and to bigots that there's no risk in unmasking themselves. There's no jeopardy in shedding their pointed hoods or exposing the swastikas that's on their chest. We live in a society today where, here in the United States, we have a president who literally began his campaign by slandering the citizens of an entire country. He called them drug dealers and rapists. And then in Charlottesville, he equated the behavior of anti-racist activists with that of the tiki torch-wielding white supremacists, one of whom rammed his car into a crowd of counter-protesters, killing a young woman and injuring 19 others. That's the society that we're living in today. And this president has dispatched the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency, ICE. He dispatched them to hunt down undocumented immigrants, rendering many of the people, many of them of our neighbors, many of whom we work with every day. These are people who pick our vegetables, they construct our homes, they clean our hotel rooms. Yet, these are people who in today's society, under this president, are too afraid, in many cases, to go outside and buy groceries. He has terminated the deferred action for childhood arrivals DACA, which gave protection to over 800,000 dreamers, innocent young people who arrived in this country in the arms of their parents, who were raised as Americans, who believed themselves to be Americans and who work every day to achieve the American dream. So I think it's important that we paint a picture. We look at reality, we look at reality and the times that we are living in today in order for us to decide in which direction we are going. In today's society, police officers, who are generally good people, to serve and protect citizens is an admirable profession. However, some of them gunned down unarmed black and brown men and boys. In Charlottesville, a line of police stood by and did nothing as a white nationalist in a bulletproof vest shot a pistol at an unarmed anti-racist activist. In our country, administration officials endorsed a proposal to repeal Obamacare and replace it with a plan that would have given massive tax cuts to the rich and denied health insurance to 22 million poor people. And stay tuned, because the same politicians is going to try this again as soon as next week. That's the society that we're living in today. And now Social Security, on which elderly poor subsist, Medicare, and food stamps are all being threatened in a proposed federal budget that has been deemed cruel and wicked in its targeting of the most vulnerable and its appeasement of the most rich. And at the same time, this administration has attacked workers as well. It delayed implementation of workplace safety rules, made it easier for big banks to cheat workers out of their retirement savings by the repeal of Dodd-Frank, and threatened to kill a rule that would qualify millions more workers for overtime pay. So see, the struggle for racial and economic justice, it didn't end with the New Deal legislation in 1935 that facilitated unionization. It didn't end with the passage of the Great Society and civil rights legislation in the 1960s, or the all too slow erosion of Jim Crow. We must continue to mind the words of Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass said that power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will. So in today's struggle, there are those who say that to succeed, each person must be willing to claw their way to the top and to step on and stomp down on neighbors and co-workers to grab that golden ring. It's a philosophy that elevates the individual. It says you're on your own. It means that the government has no place in society or in your personal lives, that the government is wrong to provide a safety net, to prevent those who hit upon hard times, those who may find themselves laid off or go through a period of joblessness, those who suffer tragedies in life like paralysis or a catastrophic loss like a hurricane or a tornado. This philosophy that says you're on your own, it denies the whole value of community. This cruel philosophy, it totally refutes the biblical decree that we are our brother's keeper, that we are our sister's keepers. And see, those aren't my values. Those aren't the values of our labor movement. You know, the values of the labor movement goes to the words of one of our most famous labor leaders, Eugene Debs. Debs said, "I would be ashamed to admit that I have risen from the ranks. When I rise, it will be with the ranks and not from the ranks." That's what we stand for in this labor movement. The ability and the solidarity that we have a movement that's designed to lift up all boats, to lift up everybody, not a select few. And what Deb's statement means to me is that we rise together, or as a people, we will perish together. It means that as a collective, we can and should pull each other up. Pull along the coworker or the neighbor or the acquaintance, those who have a limp. And then when we suffer a setback, our community will in turn give us a hands up. That's what our movement is about. And I am, as you know, I'm a labor union vice president, and I can tell you that Deb's words are basic union philosophy. Ideally, in labor unions, workers of all colors, faith, backgrounds, and experience, we embrace each other as brothers and sisters. And with the power of that unity, and only because of the power of that unity, are we able to seek better wages, benefits, and working conditions for all. And it's for this reason that the Catholic Church has for ages endorsed labor unions. It was more than a century ago when Pope Leo XIII specifically supported labor unions and the rights of workers in his 1891 encyclical entitled On Capital and Labor. And then in 1986, the U.S. Catholic bishops issued a statement in which they said no one may deny the right to organize without attacking human dignity itself. They were talking about organizing labor unions. And then the bishops went on to say, it is unfair to expect unions to make concessions if managers and shareholders do not make at least equal sacrifices. That's radical. That's some powerful stuff. You know, and I'm heartened to be amongst those from this university and from the Catholic family who believe that. You know, 2 years ago, the AFL-CIO, which the AFL-CIO is a federation of 55 labor unions, and they conducted a conference in Washington, D.C. to rebuild the historic links between unions and faith leaders. And it was there that Cardinal Donald Wuerl, whom a lot of you know is among Pope Francis' closest U.S. confidants. And Cardinal Wuerl said that both labor unions and the church faced a society that suffered from what he called a solidarity deficit, in which the individual takes precedence over the collective. He said both unions and the church are pushing back against worship of the individual to ensure that wealth created by the community of labor is more broadly shared and does not flow up to the top 1%. Wuerl told the conference that labor unions are a mouthpiece for the struggle for social justice. And then just a few months ago, Pope Francis told a group of Italian trade unionists that there is no good society without good unions. And there is no good union that isn't reborn every day in the peripheries that doesn't transform the rejected stones of the economy into cornerstones. Those rejected stones. And if you read the remainder of Pope Francis' speech, it is clear that he was issuing a challenge to organized labor. Pope Francis is saying that labor unions must protect their members, but they also bear an obligation to lift up the rejected stones of the economy. And that would include impoverished immigrants, the unemployed, the hungry, and the other in all forms, ethnically, religiously, and politically. The Pope was warning us, I strongly believe, that we all rise together or we all lose separately. Now, some of you in this room may know, heard of Richard Trumka. He's a coal miner's son. He's president of the AFL-CIO. He's a Catholic. He's a vocal proponent and supporter of Pope Francis. But I want to tell you that Leo Gerard, the president of my union, the United Steelworkers, he's also a miner's son. He's also a Catholic and also a forthright fan and supporter of Pope Francis. Me, I come from a different background. I was raised in the Church of God in Christ, an evangelical congregation whose headquarters is in Memphis, Tennessee, at a place called Mason Temple. Mason Temple is the place where Dr. King gave the prophetic "I've been to the mountaintop" speech on April the 3rd of 1968, the day before he was assassinated. And Dr. King, he traveled to Memphis to walk the picket lines with 1,300 black sanitation workers who were on strike. These sanitation workers, they worked 60-hour weeks, but 40% of them were so poor that they qualified for welfare benefits. And Dr. King told them that they are reminding the nation, not only Memphis, that it is a crime for people to live in this rich nation and receive starvation wages. and civil rights leaders like Dr. King and A. Philip Randolph, W.E.B. Du Bois, and Frederick Douglass believed that labor rights are human rights. They believed that to constrain the liberty of men and women to choose their work, to earn sufficient wages to support themselves and a family, is a right to self-determination. You see, these leaders believed that unity amongst workers could help all workers, black and white, Catholic, Jewish, and Muslims, immigrants, and native-born, that unity amongst workers is what can enable all workers to rise together. In 1961, at the National AFL-CIO Convention, Dr. King addressed the delegates and he said, "Our needs are identical with labor needs." He's talking about the black community. Decent wages, fair working conditions, livable housing, old age security, health and welfare measures, conditions in which families can grow, have education for their children, and respect in the community. Dr. King said that is why Negroes support labor's demands and fight laws which curb labor. And Dr. King continued by saying, that is why the labor hater and the labor baiter is virtually always a twin-headed creature, spewing anti-Negro epithets from one mouth and anti-labor propaganda from the other. And when we think about today, in 2017, we find that those who stand against labor rights are the same people who oppose LGBTQ rights. They are the same people who oppose immigrant rights, are the same people that oppose environmental rights and workers' rights and women's rights. These are the same people who oppose the rights of the dreamers. Labor haters to this day remain those who deny the most basic constitutional premise of equal rights for all. They're one and the same. And we have to, in this time, we have to be wise enough to realize that if they could come together and spew their hate against all of us, then we should be able to come together as a people and take a stand for what's right. Take a stand for religious liberty. Take a stand for labor rights. Take a stand for women's rights. And yes, take a stand together on behalf of those dreamers. If they can come together, the fundamental question is, why can't we? You know, sometimes achieving unity in this complex society, you know, it's easily said, but it isn't so easy. It's not all about holding hands and singing Kumbaya. In the labor movement, we know that personally, because the shooting death of 18-year-old Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri on August the 9th, 2014, it illustrates for the labor movement that Michael Brown was the son of Leslie McFadden, a member of the United Food and Commercial Workers Union. The police officer who shot him was Darren Wilson, a member of the Fraternal Order of Police. the police officer in Missouri, the police officer, that's their labor union. And because we believe in unity as a family in the labor movement, because we call each other brothers and sisters, Leslie McFadden is our sister, and Darren Wilson is our brother. So what happened, as Richard Trumka said at a conference in Missouri shortly after the killing, our brother killed our sister's son. And then President Trumka said, "And we don't have to wait for the judgment of prosecutors or courts to tell us how terrible that is. Union members' lives have been profoundly damaged in ways that can't be fixed." And Rich Trump asked the delegates to that AFL-CIO convention in Missouri that year to think about. And I call on you to think about what it would be like for people to watch their sons walk out the door, wondering with good reason if that would be the last time they would see them alive. That's the pain that we are suffering in our family. You know, this is not somebody else's problem. You know, this is the reality of life for millions of our brothers and sisters every day. So it's our problem in the labor movement. And see, that's what solidarity means. You know, Trump reminded the convention that how big employers throughout history have successfully used racism and often to divide and defeat labor unions. He described a horrible and shameful incident in East St. Louis, a town just a dozen miles from Ferguson. The year was 1917, and an employer decided to replace striking white workers with black workers, and it would become known as the Massacre of East St. Louis. It was a century ago when workers at the aluminum ore company in East St. Louis, they voted to strike, and the company hired black workers to replace them. And most of these workers were drawn from the sharecroppers in the Deep South. They was drawn from that lifestyle to come north, from places like Mississippi, where they were sharecroppers. American Ore Company actually went down to places like Belzoni, Mississippi, and bought train tickets for black sharecroppers to come to East St. Louis to replace these white workers. You know, and many of these workers, you know, they was good people, but they were drawn to a better lifestyle. And jobs were available in the North because so many young men had gone to fight in World War I. And the white strikers in East St. Louis, they were angry. They got angry about black workers taking their jobs. And they left their union hall on July the 1st, and they began 3 days of rampaging through black neighborhoods. And some 3,000 white workers beat, shot, and lynched black residents, burned homes, and destroyed businesses. The riots raged with police officers expressing an indifference to the plight of African-American citizens. And the arson left 6,000 black residents homeless. 9 white men were killed, and by official count, 39 black people died. But because black victims were not taken to the morgue, it is believed the number of black men and women and children that was killed is closer to 100. And I mention that because this is an example of a corporation winning by skillfully playing on racial prejudice to divide working people. And corporations have used the race and religion card repeatedly to divide and defeat workers. And we can't let that happen any longer. Because we believe that we all rise together, many of us lose our lives separately. And as Rich Trumpet spoke to the AFL-CIO convention that day in Missouri, he said very profoundly that in organized labor we can live our history or we can change it. And he said about changing it. Because although this is, in fact, a contest between us versus them, and the us is not white workers and the them is not black or brown or Jewish or Muslim workers, the truth is that the them is those careless, fat cat corporations that would gin up their bottom line by setting one group of workers against the other. And the us is all workers, all of us together, who should know better than to allow the CEO and the 1%ers to split us up and diminish our power of unity. We should know better than to allow racism or sexism or anti-religious bias to divide and conquer us. You know, the fact is that anything that undermines worker solidarity imperils the labor movement and the struggle for economic justice. So, the first step that President Trump took was to establish a commission. And it was called the AFL-CIO Labor Commission on Racial and Economic Justice. And I was privileged to serve as one of the co-chairs. And the idea was to create a forum for local labor leaders and activists to have a discussion, to talk about racial violence and racial justice. And the goal was to build a shared understanding amongst local labor leaders about how issues of racial justice are linked to economic justice, a more inclusive society, and an effective democracy. So between July of 2015 and between July of 2015 and March of 2016, the commission, we conducted 6 community meetings. They were held in Alameda County, California, Birmingham, Alabama, Boston, Cleveland, Minneapolis, and St. Louis. And I attended all of these. And in many cases, members of minority communities testified to just blatant racism, making me feel at times that the country has made too little progress since the massacre in East St. Louis a century ago. I heard the testimony, and I remember in Minneapolis listening to a Muslim immigrant who is a nurse. She testified about how patients, managers, and even fellow workers treated her rudely. We heard from a Latina custodian who said she was sexually harassed and passed over for promotions at the school where she worked. We heard the testimony of a black construction worker who said he was routinely called degrading names on the job. And I remember black union members in St. Louis, how they told the commission of their disappointment that so few labor leaders has spoken out about police violence. They also expressed frustration that local labor leaders supported white candidates for public office, even in black districts, and even when the white candidates supported anti-union laws. Between 150 and 200 people attended the meetings with union members and officials, and as many as 800 attended the town hall sections that included elected officials and community members. And you know, sometimes those conversations were difficult. As when one white attendee stood up and said that any person that shot by police, it was their feeling that they probably deserved it. These were difficult discussions. But I believe very strongly that there can be no reconciliation. There can be no progress toward unity if we don't have these difficult conversations. Some union officials talked about their efforts to be more inclusive, including creating apprenticeship programs where diverse participants are solicited, establishing mentor programs to ensure that minorities and women can rise within labor unions, and expanding union executive board slots to ensure a diverse leadership. So the commission issued a report earlier this year that includes a series of recommendations to improve communication, diversity, and opportunities within labor unions. And it incorporates the best practice for inclusiveness within unions, but it also acknowledges that labor must go further. It recommends, for example, that the AFL-CIO and its union affiliates support criminal justice reform, that they support efforts such as community policing and the elimination of mandatory minimum sentences. You see, we're at a point, if we're going to be successful in terms of securing the society that we were promised on paper, if we're going to be successful in doing that, then we have to have these discussions, and we have to come to the conclusion that we all going to rise together, or we all going to perish together. That's the direction of the labor movement. What we in the labor movement want to do is we want to be part of a larger movement for social and economic justice. We don't necessarily want to run it, but we need to be a part of it. We need to work more closely with the church and live by the teachings of the Pope and have those discussions about the very things that connect us as a community, as a society. You see, when we wrote the report, the report went on to say that the labor movement, we must lead an ongoing conversation about the role that racial equity and inclusiveness play in reducing economic inequality and improving the lives of all working people. And many labor leaders believe that in the richest country in the world, equity and justice are not too much to ask for, no matter on people's gender identity, religion, or the color of their skin, and certainly I do. And it's one of the reasons I became active in the labor movement, to realize those goals. And I believe that to attain economic justice, we must unite. And to do that, we must achieve racial justice. In fact, we must end bigotry of all kinds against those of different religions, those with physical disabilities, and those with differing gender identities, those with any sort of irrelevant attribute. See, we all must remember when we get into these discussions is that no matter what we call them, God, Allah, whatever the name of our Creator is, okay, We are all the creation of something higher than us. And we were all created in the image of someone greater than us. And we are all brothers and sisters that comes from a mighty God. And unless we start living in a society where race, religion, nationality, gender become a matter of irrelevancy, and we identify with each other as members of the human family, then we are on a course of deconstruction that's going to take us to a place of chaos, to a place of the haves and the have-nots, to a place where this society is not going to be as grateful to our children and our grandchildren as it was to each and every one of us. So, I believe deeply in the old labor adage, united we rise and divided we beg. And the labor movement is not in a situation today where we care to beg any longer. It's time for us to unite. It's time for us to stand together. It's time for us to lift each other up. And it's time for us to come to the realization that we are indeed our brothers and our sisters' keeper. And only together can we make this world the world that God created for each and every one of us to share as his children, as brothers and sisters. Thank you all very much. That's fine. I understand we're going to take some questions, so we got a couple of mics, so let's do it.
15, 20 minutes, and then we'll call it at 7:15, and we can spill out and have more casual conversation in the reception. Will be drinks and I think sugar and caffeine and things like that.
Good.
So Judy and Bill are nice enough to have microphones, so throw it to the crowd for questions and comments for Mr. Redmond.
Oh, we got a question right here, all right. Yes, ma'am.
Maybe if people, when they speak, could just briefly introduce yourself, say who you are.
My name is Christina Brooks. I'm an alum, but I also work for the City of South Bend and the Mayor's Office. I'm the Diversity and Inclusion and Compliance Officer for the city.
Great.
And I had a question about apprenticeship programs for local unions.
Yeah.
They don't seem to be as ethnically diverse as we all would like for them to be. And one of the challenges seems to be the hurdle of drug tests. And we know that there are a certain panel of drugs that are tested, but for synthetic opioids, those aren't added to
Right.
those drug tests. So it disproportionately affects communities of color where they're testing for marijuana and things like that. And if those are accounted for, but synthetic opioids are not, I'm just wondering what you think about
Yeah.
that policy in the labor movement and what we can do to change that.
Thank you very much. First of all, I take two parts of your question. I want to talk about the apprenticeship piece first, and we'll come back to the drug piece. You know, I grew up in Chicago, and I remember graduating from high school, and I went to apply for a job with the IBW, the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers. And I walked into the union hall, and the first thing the receptionist asked me was, do you have a letter from your alderman? Or you got sponsorship by your city council person, you know what I mean? It was a system of patronage, okay? And those of us, a bunch of us in the African-American trade union leaders, because we love our brothers in the building trades, okay? We have had some very, very serious discussions with them over the past few years. And let me say this, things have gotten a lot better. I mean, IUPAT, and International Union of Painters Allied Trades, 2 months after Ferguson, they built a apprenticeship center in Ferguson, Missouri. That's progress, okay? And we're also working with the building trades through the leadership of the Chicago Federation of Labor and its leader, Jorge Ramirez. We've also, the Coalition of Black Trade Unionists is also having a discussion with the building trades to see what we could do about building apprenticeship programs on the south and west side of Chicago, okay? Because, look, I mean, you know, in order to get project labor agreements, they got to have a diverse workforce, right? So our commitment is to help the building trades along. We think that this is a new building trades. You know, they're more progressive than they were in the past. So we're making strides. We're not where we need to be throughout the country, but in some parts of the country, we're really making progress, and we're working in others on the issue of apprenticeship, because minorities need jobs, okay? I mean, unemployment rate in black and brown communities is 3 times the national average as it is in other communities. So that apprenticeship issue is real, and we're dealing with that. The issue of drugs and opioids and the qualifications to pass an apprenticeship test, that's a serious problem. I don't have the answer. I'm just gonna be frank, I don't have the answer, because in order to get project labor agreements, you know, in order to qualify as a skilled apprentice and graduate to a journeyman, you know, it's one of the requirements to, you know, you have to be drug-free, or you at least have to be able to pass the drug test. The apprenticeship, I'm sorry, the building trades are aware that that's a problem, because it's not just affecting, I'm not saying you're wrong, but it's not just affecting communities of color now, okay? See, I struggle with the fact that when the crack cocaine epidemic hit communities of color, you know, we got 3 strikes you out. We got mass incarceration, right? And now it become an epidemic, okay? And there's a lot of, and you know, it's bad stuff, okay? But we didn't have the resources that's out there now, okay, in order to get treatment. There's a lot of money out there to get treatment. So what the building trades is trying to do now is to work through this state governments. They're having good progress with this in Ohio and West Virginia, okay, in terms of somebody fail a drug test, okay, once they apply to be an apprentice, is that they will automatically go through a state-sponsored rehabilitation program and be able to reapply upon completion of the program. That's something that we're advocating for, is getting some steam in Ohio and West Virginia, and we hope to create models in those 2 programs where we could treat this for what it is, a disease, and allow people second chances. Okay? Sure.
What are the major differences between the challenges that you see in public unions versus private unions?
Well, we're both at attack, and you know, I think what we're dealing with now is a 2-prong attack, okay? Number one, the attack on public unions, you know, starting in Wisconsin, it became more vicious, okay? Because what we're dealing with is we're dealing with public officials, all right, who are trying to lower the tax base at the expense of public workers. So, I mean, for example, there's a case pending called AFSCME versus Janus. Okay, it went through the Illinois Supreme Court. It's headed to the federal courts. Okay, and what that case would do is it would eliminate the ability of public sector unions to collect dues. Okay, collect dues. The whole public sector will be what we call right to work. And you know, the whole right to work week, I'm going to come to the private sector, but the whole right to work concept is so flawed, because basically what it says is you could belong to the union, but you don't have to pay dues. Now imagine that. Imagine going to your country club and play around a golf and you ain't paid dues. How did that work? Okay? But the goal in public sector, okay, is to force the unions out economically, okay, by telling workers that they don't have to pay union dues, and more workers get out of the union, then what happens is it strangles the union's ability to have the necessary funds to negotiate contracts and to, negotiate for wages and benefits. The public sector attack is very, very vicious, okay, because it's being promoted through legislation that's being passed in state houses around this country. 22 states now in the United States are right-to-work states. And, for example, in the state of Michigan, when we talk about public sector workers, school teachers, the school system in the state of Michigan can't take out union dues if the people want to pay union dues. It's illegal. Okay? So it's those sort of things in the state that's handcuffing unions, and they're doing it, okay, with the premise that only through attacking workers and cutting wages and pension benefits and health care benefits for public sector workers, okay, can they cut taxes for homeowners throughout states around this country. That's a bad premise, but that's the premise. In terms of the private sector workers have been hit because of offshoring, because of bad trade deals, because of loss of jobs. So the attack on private sector unions have been by desperate employers who's trying to, pay lower wages in order to be able to compete with countries like China and Mexico, where, they typically pay lower wages than they do here in the United States. So what we're dealing with now in the labor movement is a two-pronged attack, okay? The Janus case is meant to attack public sector unions. And then today, in the House of Representatives, there's a bill that's pending in committee. And we anticipate it coming out after the Janus case is heard, okay, that mandates that private sector unions, okay, any private sector employee would be forbidden from taking out union dues, and also private sector unions, we would have to recertify our unions under this legislation every year. Never heard of such a thing. So what that means is every year we got to go out and sign up our members to ensure that we got a 51% majority in order to continue to exist. All right, this is the kind of legislation that they're attacking us with. And the reason why they're doing that is because we are the only ones that stand in their way of creating a society, okay, of low-wage workers and dictating the terms and conditions of employment. We're the only ones standing in the way. So we are targets, the labor movement, but, we're not giving up. We continue in the fight. We continue to represent our members, and we continue to negotiate for wages, hours of work, and working conditions. And, we'll continue to do that with our last breath, because workers deserve a right to share in the wealth that they help to create. It's a simple premise, okay? And we're going to continue to fight for that. Next question.
Hi, I'm Dave Pasquarella from the Brotherhood of Maintenance of Way Employees. We represent the track workers that work on the nation's railroads. Thank you for your talk. It's always a delight to have somebody articulate for you in a way that you couldn't the things that that a lot of us, I think, most probably deeply believe. My question is, I was struck by the point in your talk where you talked about, or you asked, perhaps rhetorically, if forces of division can ironically unite, then why can't we? And I guess kind of piggybacking upon
Sure.
Your invocation of Dr. King and recalling some of his words about how light can drive out darkness, but not the opposite. I think we kind of have this faith that the forces of unity are ultimately stronger than the forces of division. And so, to the extent that we find ourselves today in a current setting in which that seems to be heading in the opposite direction than we think it would be heading on that basis. I wonder if you had any ideas as to what might be the possible reasons that we're seeing what we're seeing now.
Yeah, I think, thank you for the question. I think we're seeing a philosophy that's taking shape in this country in terms of what type of country we want to be. Okay, and the point that Dr. King made 50 years ago, and then we compare it to what's happening today, okay, is we're looking at forces in this country that, you know, are all controlled and all operate out the same playbook. So what we have to understand is the person who advocates against civil rights is the same person who advocates against labor rights. The same person who advocates against labor rights is the same person that advocates against women's rights. Okay? There's a philosophy in this country that's shared by, and these political things get a little deep sometimes, but there's a philosophy that's shared in this country by extreme right-wing folks, okay, that really believe that, you know, other people are the reason for your lot in life. So it's easy to blame the immigrant. It's easy to blame the LGBT community. It's easy to blame, you know, minorities. It's easy to blame folks for situations that's taking place in this country, okay, that these people aren't responsible for. It's the responsibility of an extreme policy that's being advocated in this country, you know. For example, I had a guy ask me a couple of weeks ago, he said, Fred, how you know, one of my white brothers, he said, Fred, I don't understand this, you know. How do you get your kids out your house? I got grown kids, man, they can't find a job. How do you get them out your house? I told him, man, I don't know. I gave up. I gave them the house. Me and my wife moved, you know. But the point that I was trying to make in that quote is, okay, these are the same people. So we have to identify that our fight is not against people, it's against a philosophy. It's against a fundamental philosophy, okay, that says that the government has no place, okay? We need to revoke all of these laws that protect these people, okay? And everybody got to lift themselves up from the bootstraps, all right? But, you know, it's a philosophy that's flawed because society don't work that way. I don't believe in government controlling my life, okay? But if I'm in Puerto Rico, I want some help. If I'm in Houston, I need some help. When I get 65, I never seen none of these people turn down Social Security. Okay? So there's a fundamental philosophy in this country, okay? And the thing about it is there's more of us than there are them. Okay, but because we're fragmented, okay? We're fragmented. Okay, I don't like that Obamacare. You don't like it? No, I'm under the state program. Well, that's Obamacare. I understand. I'm not under Obamacare. I'm under the Affordable Care Act. You know, people don't understand. You know, it's all one and the same, right? I know people who say, you know, well, you know, I'm not against African Americans. I think African Americans have done a lot. They done built this society. But I don't know about the Mexicans, right? You know, so what we do is we have a tendency to fragment each other and blame other people for our lot in society, okay, as opposed to attacking a fundamental philosophy in this country, okay? And that philosophy is being accelerated every day. I'm sorry, I don't mean to take too long, but I'm having fun. Yes, sir.
It's my turn. Try to push a button.
Okay, and I'll try to give us a brief answer so we.
Name's Michael Burnt. Raised here, worked here, retired here in South Bend. This is my home community. I've seen a lot of changes. Long time ago, maybe in the early 90s, there was talk between the United Steelworkers and the UAW to become one union.
And the machinists.
And the
were
machine,
the-
yes,
that's
thank
right,
you.
that's
I
right.
forgot about the machines because they were the smaller of the three unions. So you got these two powerhouse unions,
Right,
the steelworkers and the UAW and the machinists,
right.
talking about one union, and the president of the UAW suggested it become the UAW because UAW would stand for United All Workers instead of UAW, automobile, it would be the United All Workers. So is there any more talk of that at the highest levels? And whatever came of that discussion?
Well, and back then, we called it unification as opposed to a merger. But the three largest industrial unions, the UAW, the USW, United Steelworkers, and the International Association of Machinists, we were talking about getting together. And it all came to, that started with the organizing drive when we was all trying to organize U.S. Airways, And at the end, the IAM won the drive, and the three presidents, it was, we was all on the ballot. They had a labor board vote. The IAM won. The three presidents went to have a drink and, let bygones be bygones. And then they start scratching their heads, and they wonder, all three of us then spent a few $1 million trying to organize these workers. That don't make no sense, and then that led to discussions about this unification. It didn't kick off because, people had different institutional things that they didn't want to walk away from, okay? So that merger didn't kick off. I mean, for example, I'll give you a real brief example. For example, in the Steelworkers Union, when we got into, I was on that committee, as a matter of fact, and it was so stark to me was when we talked about striking the fence funds and went into everybody's books, and it was hard, and I ain't gonna say which union, but it was hard for them unions to look at the Steelworkers striking the fence fund and say, let me get this straight. Y'all spent $2.5 million, okay, supporting 150 people that was on strike at a company, and the strike lasted 2 years, and our response was, that's right. That's what we do, okay? We fight to win, and that's our philosophy, okay, is that we sustain our members during the labor dispute, and our promise is, we gonna strike, nobody's house is gonna be foreclosed, nobody's car gonna be repossessed, nobody's lights gonna be turned off, nobody's gonna go hungry. If we gonna strike, and we fighting for a principle, and we fighting for a right, okay? Some of the other unions can, that's a little too radical for some of the other unions to spend that much money, in the event of a labor dispute. That was one of the things that brought that to a halt because of different philosophies, okay? Now, we are in discussions now with other unions. We're always in discussions with other unions. I mean, last year, we had a merger with the Telecommunication Workers of Canada, and recently this year, late last year, we've had a merger with the GMP, the Glass Motors and Parters Union. So we're always looking, to find these perfect fits in order to grow our union and to grow our army. But there's always discussions. Between those three unions, there's no current discussions that's taking place at this time. Okay.
There's two mics up, two hands, these will be our last two questions.
Okay, very,
Representing Fred tonight, so
okay.
he is hand
Okay,
Very,
thank you.
very quickly, my name is
Yes,
David
sir.
Farrell. I'm a Holy Cross priest. I was in Latin America for 50 years. I worked in the underground with trade unions in Chile and also with trade unions in Peru and for a short time in El Salvador. Before the election of last year, I spent a lot of time going around on my own talking to people in stores and in businesses to see about how they would vote. And I was amazed, sir, by the number of people who got miserable wages at Walmart's and at Myers
Yeah,
who were going to vote for the Republican candidate.
yeah,
And now, during the 60s and 70s, we talked about consciousness raising, in Latin America at least, how can we raise the consciousness of our own people to defend their own rights? In fact, got kicked out of Myers by the police for what they accused me of breaking their solicitation law. I thought solicitation was something else, but they said I was trying to organize a trade union in there. So how can we get our workers themselves, sir, to recognize and be willing to do what they can? And you know, it's risky for them. I realize it is.
right. No, it's difficult. I mean, you know, we have to continue to have the dialogue. You know, I mean, it was discouraging because when we look at states like Wisconsin, Michigan, Ohio, you know, a lot of those was my members, right? And, you know, they were disgusted. They didn't feel that the Democratic Party was really looking out for their best interests. We had an incumbent president at the time was pushing for, you know, free trade, you know, a free trade agreement, you know, with, he's looking for fast track authority, you know, in order to fast track these trade agreements. And, you know, our people was losing jobs and, you know, they bought into the words of a con man, okay, a person who really got people to believe that as a billionaire, you know, you could run a sovereign government like a business, right? Well, I'm a businessman. I know how to do this stuff, okay? You cannot run a sovereign government like a country. And a lot of people really felt as though his business acumen would lead him to fix some of the most complex problems that we have in the United States, you know, like health care. I mean, the Affordable Care Act needs some fixing. All you got to do is fix what we already have, right? But, you know, I heard him say today, oh, everybody under the plan that's out there now, everybody, you know, we still gonna honor pre-existing conditions. And then a Republican senator came on out there and said, well, that's not necessarily true, you know what I mean? But here's a guy who is a professional. I mean, you know, he really, really convinced people. And a lot of our folks, you know, voted against their best interests because they was dissatisfied with the status quo, okay? They was dissatisfied with the status quo. I mean, and, you know, so they bought into Trump. Now, the best thing we have going in terms of what can we do, okay, is to keep listening to this guy. Because a lot of people now is having buyer's remorse, right? I know a lot of my members are. They said, man, I didn't buy into this, but this is what they got, okay? So, anyway.
Hi, my name is Kevin Hawkins. I'm a Notre Dame alum, and I'm also a federal mediator and a resident of South Bend.
Great.
My question, and you made some strong statements regarding faith and the labor movement. And I work for the federal government, and that's a very ticklish subject, introducing my faith life into my work life, which is with the labor movement. So how do you envision faith having greater integration in the labor movement to coalesce what your vision is going forward?
Yeah, thanks for the question. What we have to do is work more with faith leaders, you know, organizations like the interfaith workers justice organization and work with organizations work with the church on issues that pertain to social justice. I think that the relationship between the church and the unions, have to be intensified. I think that the Pope have really been a leader, in terms of connecting, for example, the Catholic religion with the work of organized labor. And we need to expand on that, by having those relationships with the church. For example, here's how this works. AFSCME have partnered with the Church of God in Christ, whereas this March in Memphis will be the 50th anniversary of the sanitation workers strike. And the Church of God in Christ and AFSCME have partnered to do a huge demonstration in Memphis, in honor of Dr. King's life and the work he did on behalf of the sanitation workers. It's those sort of partnerships with the church that we have to work more closely on and to align ourselves with, because, as Dr. King, Dr. King once said, that the two organizations or the two groups that have done more in this country to change the life of ordinary people is organized labor and the church, So, we need to connect on those principles in terms of working more closely together to reach our objectives in regards to social justice. Thank you.